I'm Megan Barnett, Vice Provost for Academic Initiatives at UVA. I am very pleased to introduce this conversation, a global imperative, free press, free flow of ideas. Freedom of the press is a core tenet enshrined in democracies around the world. The late Walter Cronkite once said, freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy. He recognized that a free and independent media is critical for informing citizens, debating ideas, and holding those in power accountable. But freedom of the press doesn't just happen. It takes vigilance and hard work to protect journalistic freedom. Journalists often risk their lives and their safety to protect the free exchange of ideas. But they need all of our help. That's why today we are honored to bring together this panel of esteemed journalists and experts to discuss the state of journalistic freedom in the U.S. and abroad, and what this might mean for the health of democracy. Our panelists today are Michael Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House. Freedom House's research and publications are the gold standard for tracking the state of democracy, including freedom of the press around the world. He spent the first 24 years of his career at the Washington Post, where he was a national editor and then White House correspondent. Amna Nawaz is the co-anchor of PBS NewsHour. Previously, she served as foreign correspondent and Islamabad bureau chief for NBC News and was a correspondent and anchor at ABC News. Susan Glasser was scheduled to join the panel today, but unfortunately she was called back to Washington. She sends her regrets. The panel will be moderated by Michael Powell, staff writer at The Atlantic. Previously, he was a national reporter at the New York Times, where he covered issues including free speech and expression, presidential campaigns, and the economy. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure for all of us to be here. And I wanted to, this is in many ways an urgent conversation and one that will take us around the world and end up back here in the United States. But I was interested really in starting off with Michael, and who, by the way, was long ago my editor at the Washington Post. And ask you, if you would give us a bit of a tour of the horizon right now when it comes to press freedoms around the world, if you would.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you for reminding me of that. I had actually forgotten that I'd been your editor at one time. But thankfully, you still wanted to see me, and Amna, great to be with you. It's great to be here. As Megan said in her opening remarks, Freedom House has tracked the state of democracy around the world for 50 years. We just actually enjoyed the 50th anniversary of Freedom in the World, which is our kind of flagship report. And I would say, just in a nutshell, I want to just make this a little bit broader than journalism, that democracy is under attack around the world. If you look at our data, every year for the last 17 years, countries have experienced more countries have experienced declines in political rights and civil liberties than those that have had improvements. And this is happening, obviously, in the authoritarian world, countries like Russia and China, but also, sadly, it's happening in the democratic world among countries like India, Poland, Hungary, and the United States, and we can probably get to that. I think what's really interesting when you look at the data is that the decline is being driven by a number of factors, but I think one major factor is the decline of free expression, the decline of independent journalism that really comes through all of our data. And just a couple of points to say, Freedom in the World has an indicator for media freedom. 17 years ago, only 14 countries received the lowest score for media freedom. 14 had a zero. We rate from 0 to 4, 4 being the highest level of media freedom. This past year, 33 countries had a 0 score. So that really gives you a sense. A couple of weeks ago, we put out another important report that we do, which is freedom of the net, which really looks at online human rights, but really a lot of it has to do with journalism, because really the internet has become the platform for free expression, or lack of, in the world. And that was really a disturbing report as well. And just, again, two numbers. We had 52 countries that had punished individuals for the content they had posted online. This is broader than journalists, but journalists are caught up in this. And this also includes countries, Iran and Myanmar, who actually executed people for really nothing more than the free expression online. We also had countries, a large number of countries, actually shut down the internet to prevent journalists and others from communicating. So really the big picture is very grim, and we can dig into that, but I would say that the big picture is very grim for journalism.
And do the two, that is sort of that broader sense of freedom, right, not sense of freedom, the broader freedom that one looks for in a society, and press freedom tend to track, I assume, or no?
Well, I think there's some other things that track, but I certainly feel that some of the key things that have declined as part of this decline in democracy have been press freedom. I also think the independent judiciary. I think you see around the world jurists and judges under attack. And then I think the other area, which I think about a lot, is corruption. Many of the countries that are deteriorated from a point of view of democracy have suffered serious corruption. And by the way, journalists, I mean, that's one of the most important roles of journalists, is to expose this the rot that's at the heart of some of these authoritarian settings, which is wildly corrupt. So I think it kind of all goes together.
Thanks. Amna, you've been on the very front lines in a lot of these places, and I'm interested, I guess you're based in Pakistan, but you also covered Kabul and any number of other places that are where these sort of freedoms are threatened. And I guess I'm interested in your sense of, you know, what you saw on the ground, and how these kind of larger statistics and other things play out in personal terms.
Yeah. Let me just say, Michael, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be here with you, Michael, as well. For purposes of the conversation, I'll go by Michael, too, if that just makes it easier for everyone.
That's really confusing.
Yeah. Look, I think the points that Michael made are ones we see on the ground all the time. I should say also we rely heavily on the incredible work done by Freedom House just to keep track of these kinds of things, because sometimes something unfolding on the ground in one community or one country needs the context of what's happening more broadly in the world. And we are at a very, very worrying time when it comes to these press freedoms more globally as well. Look, on the ground in places like in Pakistan, Afghanistan, been on the ground in Syria and Turkey and in Haiti, you see the role that journalism plays in democracies that aren't well established, which is to say getting out the stories that then the rest of us in the world need to know. I mean, I think back to what happened in Iran, and one of the most potent stories of the last year, which was the murder of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the so-called morality police. We would not know about that story were it not for a local journalist who first reported on it, that then got picked up by other regional journalists, that then got picked up by the rest of the world, that was then able to cover these historic protests, the likes of which we've never seen in a country. And remembering that line, I think, from that first story to where that story is today and how the rest of the world knows about it, is invested in it, is really important. That said, that journalist was arrested, and her fate was called into question for a very long time. And this is what we see again and again in countries where there is not a functioning, strong democracy, where a free and fair press does not operate unfettered, that those journalists put their lives on the risk quite literally every day just to get those stories out. And there are places that we expect this to happen. I think when you look across the world, the top 5 most prolific jailers in the world are places like China and Iran, Myanmar, Belarus, I think. But now Turkey is in that top jailer category as well. Turkey is a NATO ally. Turkey is a country that the United States has a very deep and invested and long relationship with. And I think the lines get a little blurry. It used to be very clear this is an authoritarian regime. Democracy is not supported here. It's not a safe place to do journalism. There are more places where we're in the gray, where there are so-called democracies or declining democracies, eroding democracies, where journalism is also then more at risk.
You know, one of the occasionally I've had the privilege of going to the Committee to Protect Journalists for their dinner, and it's just incredibly moving, right, to hear these stories of local journalists in all of these places that take, the risks they take make, it's astonishing. I almost don't understand what keeps them going given the risks they face. To what extent does that play out? You were based in Pakistan, you're going to many of these countries. Are you, when as an outsider, as an American, are you able to report there? How does that work?
Well, here's the privilege of the blue passport,
right? That's what I'm getting at.
Which is you get to drop in, you get to do your job, and then you get to leave. And that is a real privilege that I never lose sight of, because we often rely on local journalists to be able to make contacts on the ground, to be able to get access on the ground, and then we have to leave. So one of the core tenets I always try to hang on to is I never want to do anything on the ground that's then going to further put at risk the local journalists who don't have the privilege of leaving, right, who have families there and who stay and continue to work. And Pakistan was a good example of that. It was very easy as an American at the time. I was reporting there for years, but the years I was running the Bureau were between 2011 and 2014. Those were times of very high tension between the U.S. and Pakistan. And there was a lot to be critical of, where the U.S. money was going, corruption aspects in the military and the government. They found Osama bin Laden hiding in Pakistan. There was a lot to report on. And you had to balance it in a way that you were getting at the truth, you were reporting the facts, but you weren't putting the people on the ground you worked with at risk. And I have nothing but the utmost admiration for them, because they knew the risks, and they know the risks still, and they continue to do the work.
Right.
Michael, if I may just add one thing. I essentially agree with Amna's basic point that the Western journalists or journalists from outside are largely immune, but not entirely. Yeah. We have to remember what happened in Russia with Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal. That was an unbelievable breach of really normal activity by a sovereign government. Putin has thrown hundreds of Russian journalists in jail, hundreds of human rights activists. He's really clamped down in a very significant way, but he did not, he had not crossed the line of actually imprisoning a fully accredited by the Russian Foreign Ministry Wall Street Journal reporter. I thought that was an unbelievable action in many different ways, and really a sign of just how depraved that government has become. The other thing I would add to that is the idea that journalists are safe from authoritarian powers in democracies is really being questioned. Some of you may have heard about this this Iranian journalist, Masih Alinamajad, who had been a VOA journalist. The Justice Department broke up a plot that involved the Iranian Secret Service basically trying to kidnap Masih from Brooklyn, which is a neighbor of Michael.
She lived three doors away from us.
So we have really tracked at Freedom House this larger phenomenon of what we call transnational oppression. Think about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist, in Turkey by a Saudi hit squad. So I think one thing that we are quite concerned about is that the kind of dangers against journalists are really multiplying.
And why is that? Why do you think? Why now?
Well, I think it goes to the point that Amna was making, and that the Walter Cronkite quote really got at. Journalism is absolutely central to democracy, right? If you don't have journalists reporting, informing the public about what is going on with a specific government, I don't think democracy can suffer. The authoritarians know that. What was one of the first things that Vladimir Putin did when he took office in 2000 is that he forced the largest independent broadcasting outlet under the control of Gazprom, and basically took out a major source of independent reporting on the Russian government. So there is really a strong push by authoritarian leaders, and sadly, I think leaders in democratic societies too, and we can talk about that, to really go after journalists. I think one thing that I'm a former journalist, so I think about this, but I think of the kind of threats to journalists today. It's physical, it is digital, it's also economic, right? In places like Hungary and the Philippines, think about Maria Ressa, who is one of the most famous journalists in the world now. She won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, and the Philippine authorities have basically trying to drive her out of business with trumped up tax charges. And so it's really journalists. I really feel for my former colleagues what they are under today all over the world.
If I may too, just on the question of why now, I think, just to be candid, why now? Because they know they can get away with it. I mean, Evan has now been imprisoned for over 6 months, I believe, maybe even 7 or 8. I don't know what you would say the accountability has been for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I think this is where we can't divorce any one of these actions that leaders are taking targeting journalists from the broader context, which is to say who's going to hold them accountable given everything else that's going on. I know we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I think that's important too. If there's no accountability, if there's no country with the moral high ground to say you can't crack down on journalists, you have to free this person, you will be held accountable for this murder, then they can get away with it.
Actually, that's it's a great pivot to, I mean, I am fascinated by the interplay between these great dangers and, if you will, kind of great big power politics. And look, the United States being still, I think, fair to say, the dominant world superpower. And I wonder to what extent that complicates, informs some of this. Not to argue, I mean, not take away from agency and all sorts of bad things that happen in other countries, but to what extent superpower politics, I mean, think of Khashoggi, the American initial response to that was very tough on the Saudis. We've obviously now, that is the government, has had a rapprochement with the Saudis, and I guess I wonder, what is that interplay? And you've seen it on the ground, and I guess I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, none of this can be divorced from the context. And of course, we as journalists would like to believe that, as the Biden administration has stated, they will always put democratic values at the heart of everything that they do. All of that is subject to all the other things on their priority list right now, which is growing by the day and is getting more complicated by the day. The war in Ukraine changed the geopolitical landscape. The new war in the Middle East has further complicated and changed it and has added new layers to all of this. In dealing with Russia and in defending Ukraine, the release of American hostages becomes one of many things that they are now dealing with in a way that it wouldn't have been had there not been an ongoing invasion from Russia. Turkey, again, is a prime example in all of this. They've doubled the number of journalists behind bars in the last 2 years, and Turkey is a NATO ally. The U.S. relies on Turkey not only in terms of countering Russian aggression in any way, but also in a number of other regional factors, and they need that relationship to remain strong. So where does that fit on the U.S. list of priorities with Turkey? Doesn't seem to be very high because we have yet to see any kind of public pronouncement against the jailing of those journalists. India is another great example. They've been cracking down under the Modi government on the free and fair press. They raided the offices of one online news outlet not too long ago. Modi remains very popular, and India remains a key part of the U.S. regional relationship, also with regards to countering China and Russia. So where does that fit on their list of priorities? We are here talking about the free and fair press because we know how important it is to a functioning democracy. Unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't necessarily have the leverage and the moral high ground at this moment to make that their number one priority.
Michael, interesting. Thank you.
I 100% agree with what Amna just said. I think it's ever thus that the United States, in its foreign policy, is going to be juggling these so-called realist concerns, like what is our relationship going to be with Saudi Arabia, what is our relationship with China, what is our relationship with Turkey. I think we recognize that. I would say I think it's important for the administration, all administrations, I'm not saying, to elevate these democracy issues, these human rights issues in their dialogue with countries. We understand that, that there are going to be trade-offs, but I think we're going through a phase now where these issues are not elevated enough. And I think the other point that I would make that's related to that is that I think it's sometimes mistaken to look at these issues of democracy and human rights as like nice to have issues. I actually think it's crucial to the success of the United States. If our country is surrounded by more and more countries that treat people poorly, that don't respect human rights, then I think it's going to be really hard for us to have positive trade relations and peaceful relationships with other countries. I think there's a connection. And the other thing I would say, the conversation really highlights for me how important it is for the United States to be itself a beacon of strong democracy. One of the things that Freedom House does is we work around the world with hundreds of human rights activists, journalists and others, often who are carrying on amazing work in very difficult circumstances. When things like January 6th happen and the Capitol is stormed, that is a problem for us, but it also really saps our moral stature. I can't tell you how many of our colleagues around the world would be talking to my people who work on my staff and saying, what's going on in America? And that really empowers the Iranians and the Chinese and all those others. It's a huge propaganda victory. So I think it's really super important for this country to take these issues more seriously at home than I think we have in recent years.
Thanks. I want to just move briefly to something that's obviously right in front of us all right now is what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And, we've seen, among other things, a Reuters journalist was killed the other day in Lebanon by a missile, covering the war, and from that side. And I wonder, how we look at, here you have this incredibly, one of the most charged conflicts, right, in the world. You have, frankly, reasons at any given moment to worry on both sides whether you're getting from the government or what passes for the government in the case of Gaza, the truth, right, or anything approximating that. And I wonder, does it speak, I guess, to our moment, in terms of how we think about, the importance of press freedom. I know, for instance, and I'll add one more thing, within Gaza, obviously it's extremely difficult for independent Arab journalists to work. They're under enormous pressure from their government. Obviously, they're under bombardment at the same time. So it's, anyway, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, in some ways it is sort of a microcosm of all these issues we're talking about under the worst of all circumstances, which is to say an ongoing war. Like, the stakes could not be higher, not just for people on the ground, but for the region, and I think the rest of the world as well. And I think it's important to remember, to your earlier point, there have been something like, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but 15 Gazan journalists who've been killed in the last 2 weeks of Israeli bombardment. And I have to say, we at NewsHour rely heavily on our colleague on the ground because it is the only way we're getting independent, verifiable information from someone we trust on the ground there. We cannot go there, and this is a key example of a story in which access can dictate content. We can only report what we know, and we only know what we know based on his reporting, and so it's very difficult. The hospital blast is also a key example of this, because we got the initial reports, and you'll remember a number of outlets reported Palestinians say Israeli airstrike kills hundreds. I think the estimate at the time given from the Gaza Health Ministry was 400 or 500. And a number of outlets who are pressed for, churning out content right away, getting things out online, ran with that as the initial assessment, which was factually true at the time. Palestinians say this is what happened, until the Israelis came out with a different narrative to counter that. We saw the result of that on the streets. Who's to say whether or not the headlines had any influence over that? But that many people being killed in one incident was just fuel on a fire that was already burning. And I'll also say, in the days since, what I'm really proud of, especially at the work we're doing at NewsHour, and I think a lot of journalists are striving to do, is to continue to be skeptical of information coming from both systems of power in this, which is to say the Gazan Health Ministry, which is connected to Hamas and has an interest in giving us a higher death toll in certain circumstances, and the Israeli government, which is continuing to carry out a mission based on their national security, but is also invested in giving us lower death tolls. And I'm sure many of you have seen the ongoing investigations into exactly where this rocket was launched from. Is this audio recording they provided us credible? What are the numbers? Are we actually going to know numbers? I'll tell you from experience, we rarely know numbers in war. We tell you what we're told based on authorities, and we say, this is what they're saying. And in this situation, that's the best we can do. And it may not be satisfying for a lot of people. It's not for me many days, but just to be able to say, this is what folks over here are telling us, and this is why we have reason to believe these parts are true. And this is what people over here are telling us, and this is why we have reason to believe it's true. And this is the perfect example of, I think, the kind of moment where I say we need to be relentlessly skeptical of all the information and also ferociously empathetic to the people who are caught in the middle. And that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and I'll just say it quickly, and I'd like Michael said, as a former New York Times reporter, and one incredibly proud to have worked there, and with unbelievable respect for the reporters, the Times got it wrong, in my view. I mean, they went with the headline initially. Not the reporting. The reporting actually was quite careful, but the headline played, and I thought it was, it went against what they've taught, what they teach very importantly at the Times, which is, on school shootings and any number of things, never get ahead of what you know. You can say, here's what one side said, here's what another side said, but it's very, it's thin ice that's breaking into, open water to kind of go, I think, unfortunately, where the Times went for that few hours, and those were crucial few hours. But anyway, Michael, your thoughts?
Well, I would empathize with what the both of you are saying. I guess 2 points. First is, I think the whole situation underscores, the real importance of organizations like the Times, NewsHour, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and there are also, by the way, a lot of good organizations, news organizations in Israel that are fact-based reporting. I think that the challenges of reporting inside Gaza, you reference, but it's, there are really not a lot of news organizations that have the resources to really approach a situation like what's happening in Israel-Palestine with the seriousness and the time. I mean, I forget the quote that someone said to me, but it's really important to me, I think, to get it right as opposed to be first sometimes. And I think that is lost in the kind of, 24/7, Twitter, Facebook, everyone's got to get something first. But I think on something like this, the ability to take time and really report out as best you can what is happening. In some cases, you don't know everything, and you have to be honest with your audiences that you don't know that. I think there are very few organizations that have that ability, and one of the challenges in the world today is that is being lost. that's one of the casualties of the tremendous economic changes in news. I mean, what I think, you look around the world, we talk about news deserts here in the United States. There are huge news deserts around the world. There is no independent reporting on what's happening inside Russia, what's happening inside China, what's happening in large parts, and that's getting worse and worse and worse. So I think one of the challenges for journalism is going to be to figure out how we can continue to report on these places with accuracy, but really almost from exile, because any journalist who actually speaks up in some of these countries is going to be thrown in jail or killed.
And following up on that, excuse me, to what extent, I wonder, does technology present a real problem for the freedom of the press? That is, the ability to track reporters, not just us, right? I mean, if you will, more privileged American sorts, but also local reporters. The ability, drones to follow them around. I mean, frankly, perhaps to kill them. And I wonder to what extent cumulatively does that chill?
Well, I think it's a very good point. I see it maybe a little bit as a double-edged sword. I think that compared to, one of my last foreign trips when I was a White House correspondent, I went with President Bush to Beijing in 2008 for the Olympics. And I think there were a lot of Western journalists there. I think it was possible to interview people that might not have the authority, not be authorized by the government. My sense now, almost impossible to kind of really report in the serious way that people like the two of you are used to in a place like China. You add that like Iran. So I think you're right. The flip side to that, though, is that I think technology is going to open up, new vistas for reporting on some of these authoritarian settings. I think that, figuring out, for instance, ways to kind of break the firewall, to talk to people inside Iran, inside China, inside Russia, the surveillance, again, that's bad, but also you can have satellite surveillance that document war crimes. So I think the key is to there can be technology for the good, and I think we have to really push for that. There's been some very bad impacts of technology on this profession over the last 10 years, but I think we also need to remind ourselves not all hope is lost.
Sure, like the town in Ukraine, right, where the Russians committed the war crimes, and through satellite images we were able to document some of that. Interested in your thoughts.
I mean, technology is both like the best thing to ever happen to journalism and also the worst thing to ever happen to journalism. There are so many parts of the work we do every day that rely so heavily on pieces of technology we didn't have when I began my career 20 years ago. And I struggle to remember, how did we do our jobs back then again? You think about the story, I think about the murder of George Floyd. Think about the first reporting, as I mentioned, on Mahsa Amini. Think about some of the social media reports we're seeing coming out of Gaza. These are pieces of the story we would never have seen, stories that probably would have never taken off the way that they did were it not for the technology. And yet it deeply terrifies me because technology, like any other system of power, can be manipulated by people in positions of power, and we're seeing that. What really, really frightens me is, artificial intelligence that's used for bad, deep fake technology, the kind of things that we've already seen take off in some instances and spark real world violence. I mean, we're talking about life or death issues here, and it's because of a few, clicks on a mouse and some technology, and off this content goes into the world, and it's already zipped around before anyone has a chance to realize it's there and try to correct it. And that correction never goes as far as the original bad piece of information. So it's something we worry about all the time. It's one of the reasons that we, especially at NewsHour, we both have the privilege of taking our time to put this information together before it goes out into the world. But we also now have the responsibility to push back against that bad information that technology allows for.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, the element of this that I really worry about, now I'm going to put my negative hat on, is the power of social media, the power it gives the bad guys, particularly authoritarians, to intimidate and to threaten reporters. And it's not just physical threats. I remember reading an article about Jamal Khashoggi after he was murdered, in which Jamal Khashoggi was deeply emotionally feeling vulnerable because the Saudi government and its allies would unleash basically Twitter mobs against him. Yeah. And he would get up in the morning and he would see his social media accounts overrun by just people being nasty and mean. That never existed when I was a reporter, right? I left in 2009. People would write letters or post things on the, but now it's especially for women journalists, the kind of misogyny that's online in terms of attacking any woman journalist who, provides some independent reporting on a fact is really worrisome. I think that's the element, that's not government censorship in a way, but that does inhibit the free and independent practice of journalism in a very real way. And so I think getting control of that, I think, should be a major, public policy objective for policymakers.
So that, in turn, is a very good pivot to what I want to do now, which is to take us back to our own backyard and look at what is happening here. And clearly, it's by no means the story, but that sort of social media abuse is something that all reporters are familiar with. I do think it's particularly bad for female reporters, but it's pretty unpleasant no matter what. I guess I was interested in sort of your thought on kind of
how bad my online hate is.
Well, that too, yes,
Confirmed.
But also just what's happening here and kind of I think you had mentioned your thoughts around January 6th and watching that, and I guess I was interested in.
Yeah, and I think the two, to your point, are deeply connected. As we've all become more extremely online over the course of my career in particular, I'll tell you, in the last, since 2015, the amount of hate and negative on the lighter side of the spectrum, and really brutal and dangerous on the other side of the spectrum, comments that I get online is really kind of exponentially taken off. And the difficulty as a journalist, too, is you don't know who's serious and who's not. The vast majority of it is anonymous avatars and bots even, and you don't know until the one death threat pops up, and then you have to spend time with your security team running it down to make sure this isn't someone who lives down the street from you or is targeting you in any one way. And I've had those instances in the past. And this is just part of the job now, unfortunately. But where we saw it all come to a head, a lot of these issues we've been talking about, for me, was this moment that I honestly still have trouble processing, because I was outside the Capitol on January 6th. And I remember watching as these mobs of people physically stormed the Capitol, physically battled with officers, violently broke their way into the Capitol building. And then we all saw what happened. And I remember reporting on it live for NewsHour. We were in special coverage for hours and hours and hours that day. I was outside with my team, and my colleague, Lisa Desjardins, was inside during all of this. And I remember just thinking, I have seen this scene so many times. I have seen this kind of physical, political violence play out in countries across the world, and I never thought it would happen here. And I think a lot of people felt that way. We never thought it would happen here because we thought there was something unique and special about our democracy, that we were somehow immune to many of these same pressures of authoritarian tendencies and lack of trust in institutional power and disillusionment with our systems. And January 6th laid bare to us that we're not, that our democracy is just as vulnerable, that our democracy could suffer the same ends that we've seen in other places. We are at a different place in our story than other nations, I'll say. But I think that really hit home for me that day, that all those years I spent on the front lines in foreign countries across the nation hit home in a way that they hadn't with any other story.
Mike, your thoughts?
I'm not sure what to add to that. You know, what I was thinking about as I was listening, I think that journalists also have a responsibility to use social media wisely. I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed, everyone's noticed, I mean, look, a lot of our institutions have really suffered a major decline in public confidence, right? I think maybe with the exception of the military, but certainly the government, the media, all the other core institutions. But there is a astounding lack of trust in the media right now. I wish I could recite the polls, but it really is. And I think to some extent that is manufactured by people that have ulterior purposes, but I think it's also brought on a little bit by the media itself. You know, when you and I were at the Washington Post, Michael, we didn't go on TV. We didn't really tweet. You know, our stories stood for themselves, and that's the way we spoke to the public. And I think we have to also question whether the wide discussions on social media by some journalists, not all, you know, adds to the kind of confusion about the role of journalists. Journalists are not, I mean, there is an opinion page, but in general, the journalists like you're not commentators on the situation. You are reporting the facts and letting people, you know, draw their own conclusions. So I think that's something that I think is important for us to think about as part of the equation.
And yet some, and certainly it's been argued, right? Some of our colleagues have argued, well, essentially for in this kind of a charged, fraught moment, you know, if you will, a resistance model, right? That, you know, no, we're going to, you know, it's our responsibility to tell the truth. I will admit that I find that a problematic thought because the truth, you know, the truth, big T, is a very, very difficult thing to get at, as we were just talking about in Israel and Gaza, you know, rather spectacularly. But I wonder, you know, at the same time, and I don't want to, I mean, we have a great tradition in this country going back 250 years of advocacy journalism, right? I mean, that's a part of our ecosystem. So I'm not, you know, I mean, it does seem to me there's many different and important kinds of journalism that can and should go on in a healthy democracy. And I guess I wonder, you know, how do we navigate that? And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts as well.
I think we think a lot about this issue of trust because we have seen declines in trust across every single institution of power here in the United States. And now the Supreme Court isn't immune to that as well. And part of that, I think, is the politicization by people in political positions of power, right, dragging every institution into partisan fights and making you pick a side about which side you'll be on, how you feel about this. The best thing, I think, for journalists to do, as you say, is do the work.
Right.
You focus on the facts. It's fidelity to the facts always. It's, you know, without fear or favor. It is reporting. It's also analysis, I will say, which is a step beyond just a clear recitation of the facts. And I think all of those things are responsibilities. I also think trust means something different to different people. I'd like to think at NewsHour have built up trust over generations of showing up and reporting news that is provably true again and again and again, and you don't get trust overnight, you build it up over time. But there are some, I think, factions of our country who trust sources of information because they confirm to them what they already believe to be true, even if it isn't provably true. Or they make them feel a certain way about something that they wish was true, even if it's not provably true. And that's not necessarily trust. I think that's familiarity, that's loyalty, that's something else. But I think when we ask people, who do you trust, I think we need to take into account that some people think trust is something different than what I would say trust is in news. Because there are outlets out there that are partisan-based that are not delivering news. They're delivering content and information that people turn to because it taps into a certain emotional and like an outrage factor inside a lot of folks. In terms of building it back, we have no choice. We as journalists have no choice but to continue to show up every day and do our jobs. And when it comes to, people ask all the time, oh, how, you know, you're clearly biased towards this. And I will say I get attacks from every part of the political spectrum, that one day I'll interview someone from one party and they say, well, you're clearly in the tank for this party. The next day we'll have someone from the other side on, they say, well, you're so biased against them. And I take that as a compliment. I think that's me doing my job if I am equally skeptical of anyone who comes across our show. But we have no choice but to show up and do our jobs the only way we know how to do it. That is how we build up that trust. And I'll tell you, in times of big news, where I get hope, not to be too cynical about this, where I get hope is that when people look for information in times of big news, when there's a war launching in Ukraine, or when there's a global pandemic, or when there's a wildfire in Hawaii, we see our numbers go up. And that to me is a sign of hope, that when it really matters, people will turn to sources of information that they know they can trust.
What about the economic disintegration I mean, I don't want to turn this into a business seminar on journalism, but it is difficult, and I speak as someone who has a son working in local journalism in Houston, Texas. I mean, there's been this, as we know, this just enormous shrinking of outlets, particularly at the local level. And local's an interesting word, right? Because it sort of implies, it's, like the lowest level. No. It's like places like Houston and Dallas and Tulsa and Chicago. And I mean, it's, these places are rapidly shrinking and continue to shrink. And I guess I wonder, how does that play at this time of super polarized politics?
Well, as I said in my earlier comments, it's a global phenomenon. There's been a substantial erosion of what I would just call fact-based independent reporting about public affairs. Now there's some interesting developments that are happening. I saw the MacArthur Foundation and a number of other foundations are putting $500 million into trying to shore up local news. There's efforts on a global scale to do that. But I think, going to the point about trust, I think it's important. How to say this? I agree that editorial analysis and news are all important in this, right? But I think it's important to really be clear with readers and viewers which is which. Mm-hmm. And I think to me, I'm gone from journalism for 13 years. So I'm like, and I love journalism. I love the places that you guys work, and I think they're terrific. But I do think that there is this lack of trust, and because people don't feel sometimes they get the straight shot at things. Yes, people understand that there are going to be lots of opinion outlets. That's totally fine, and as it should be. But I think what's really missing is not opinion, but what's really missing is just the facts, ma'am. And I know that I'm kind of old school on that, but that's super important in the current environment. It's super important. Just to go to the example it's like, what is the truth concerning war crimes, in Gaza? What really happened with these bombing strikes? Only places like, the NewsHour or the New York Times or the Atlantic can really get to the bottom of that, I think. And I'm not just saying American institutions, there's also institutions overseas, but I think that is so important to the future of democracy, having that independent, fact-based approach.
Right. I wonder, just to jump back, so a place like India, India's a good one because it's a democracy for all of its problems. And, it is a democracy, and under, when you look at the grand sweep of India, under incredibly difficult circumstances, poverty and, vast number of languages. I mean, it's really a magnificent achievement, and yet now so threatened. And I wonder what role journalism, or I guess to back up, it would look like, in this case, Modi, the prime minister, is very aware that journalism is a potential, in a positive sense, potential glue there, and can, or a searchlight to kind of shine light on things. How can we as societies, kind of encourage that or push back when you've got a Modi? I mean, we know it's difficult enough in this country. Mm-hmm. What do you do there?
The Indian example is so interesting to me because it is technically the world's largest democracy. And Modi is very popular. And at the same time, has also targeted Muslim communities and allowed for horrific abuses of human rights and empowered a dangerous nationalist sentiment that allows for those kinds of things to happen and crack down on the free and fair press. And this is the part of the conversation. It's like all of these things can be true at the same time, And, if there was a role for us as journalists outside of India, I would say it's this, which is what we've tried to do, which is to shine a light. We choose every day which stories to highlight. We choose every day who we're going to put in front of our microphones and where we're going to focus. And we have done a number of stories, both on India's role in terms of its relationship to the U.S. and U.S. interests abroad right now. India, I believe, was still buying discounted fuel from Russia even as the war continues. And the U.S. role in trying to pull India back into its orbit, but also highlighting some of the crackdowns on journalists by having some of them on the show to say, what is it you have been through? Some of the crackdowns are not just raiding offices, as they've done recently. Some of the crackdowns are filing case after case after case of tax-type related lawsuits that will just tie the journalist up and drain their bank accounts and force them to stop working and doing the work that Modi doesn't want them to do. And that's our job, is kind of just shine the light where we can, I think. It's not my role to say what the administration's job is in any of this, but I think there are legitimate questions being asked by some of the analysts who followed the region for years, which is to say, what are the conversations behind closed doors? How hard can the U.S. administration press at this time to stop some of the human rights abuses or the crackdown on the press? And as we've seen, there haven't been any public pronouncements against those, and I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know.
Right.
One point I may add, Mike, is I think, from where I sit, I think India is a super important country for the future of freedom. I really do. If you look at our scores in general, for all the problems in places like India and the United States and some other democracies, we have to put it a little bit in perspective. It's not gigantic censorship. It's not, journalists are still free to, do their, certainly in our country, they're still free to do their practice. But why is India so important? Because they are, it's about the future and whether the tactics that they are pursuing there against journalists are going to become widespread around the world. Everyone expects, China and Russia to do what they're doing. But if India, for instance, the social media companies, and for whatever their flaws may be, they're after Twitter, they're after Google, they're after Facebook to take down content that they don't like. Not content that's genocidal, content that just exposes Modi. And if they get away with that, then that just fuels what authoritarian powers are doing. So it's not saying that India or the United States is the same as China and Russia. They're not. They're much freer countries. But what's happening in these countries are so important for the future cause of freedom. And I think India is really ground zero of this kind of battle over whether liberal values, liberal small L, are going to prevail or whether more authoritarian power politics are going to prevail.
How about along those lines, Poland, Hungary, what do you see there?
Well, by the way, Poland is actually an interesting story of democratic resilience, right? And by the way, I think that we got to have some hope. If you look around the world, it's amazing the level of protest that's gone on over the last 10 years. Really, you think about in Hong Kong, 3 or 4 million people went onto the streets to protest the Chinese government's restrictions of liberty in Hong Kong. In Sudan, there was a popular rebellion, protest against one of the worst genocidal governments, in the world. In Myanmar, there was lots of protests. So the fact that these protests are being brutally repressed by authoritarian regimes does not deny the fact that there is actually a demand for freedom, for dignity, for human rights, for openness. And so Poland is actually an interesting story because I think over the last 10 years, Freedom House and other human rights organizations have documented, very serious erosions of some of the core liberties that we hold dear. Speaking about the media, Poland has turned what had once been a public broadcasting system that was kind of like the BBC into kind of an arm of the government. And that is very concerning. But despite all that, it looks like the government is going to be ousted now. And so that says to me that's part of this kind of, we don't get involved in politics, I'm not saying good or bad, but I'm just saying that it's an example of how liberal values democracy is not dead. And we have to take hope from that and not just think that all is grim.
Well, on that, on that positive note, I think we'll actually now move for questions. Am I correct? Using the QR code that you have, and we will have people taking your questions.
Hi, my name is Adrian. I am a current master's student in statistics here at the University of Virginia. And a question from the audience that I'd like to share is, a major political movement led by the former president openly considers the press enemies of the state, and it's supported by a lot of elites, billionaires, who, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, actively destroy publications and online conversation spaces they see as threats to their power. Yet, discourse in recent years has been dominated by concerns about the freedom of that movement to publish their lies about the 2020 election, trans people, vaccines, etc. Lies which in turn further degrade trust in the press among millions of Americans. How do you square with those things? Is the press playing a role in its own demise?
Go ahead.
I guess I'll take that one. Thank you for the question. Look, I don't think it's any secret that the last few years in particular presented new challenges for the press in a way that, quite frankly, I'll say I don't think we were ready to deal with. And that was just a creation of sort of an alternate reality in which facts don't really matter. That if you say something loud enough and often enough people will believe you. And the key example of that, I think, is the lie about the 2020 election being stolen, which is still incredibly potent in American society. Some 60% of self-identified Republicans still believe that the election was fraudulent, and it is not only worrying and frustrating, it's incredibly dangerous for our democracy. That said, in terms of the press participating in our own demise, one thing I'll say is I'd like to separate out who we're talking about when we say the press. I know we often talk about the media and the press, and I want to talk about straightforward news and journalism outlets like the NewsHour, who I know have a fidelity to the facts and are driven by a search for the truth every day. And that is to say, the challenge for us is, how do you handle those lies? And there were for years, I'm sure many of you now, active discussions about whether you ignore the bad information because it's obviously not true. So why would you even give it the time of day? Are you breathing more oxygen into something that is clearly just not true and in service to our audience? And what we quickly realized was those lies don't need us to be amplified. We are not the only source of information for people out there. And it is not only necessary for us, it's incumbent on us to pick up on those lies and tell you why they're not true. And different outlets do this to different degrees in different ways, right? We now have fact checkers at places like the Washington Post in ways we did not before. At the NewsHour, we have conversations all the time about when and how to push back on obviously false information. And oftentimes it's just, has this risen to a level where it is dangerous for society? The pandemic was a great example of this. When there's bad information out there about vaccines or treatments, you're talking about people's lives. We have to talk about this and tell you why this thing is not true and why you need to know the truth. I am biased, but I would say that journalists today are still learning. I think that's true. I think we're still learning how to handle the onslaught of lies and this atmosphere of misinformation and active disinformation that is new and is not going away. The genie does not go back in the bottle right now. But I'll also say that every single journalist I know at every single news outlet, there are good journalists at every single news outlet, and I mean that, take this very seriously and are dedicated to trying to figure out how to push back against it. And I think that's all I can say. I hope that answers the question.
Well, let me add one thing to that, if I may. I think your question really points to a very profound challenge for us, which is, how do you balance the free speech rights that we all hold dear, particularly in this country, against really the ability of certain enterprises to use openness to kind of undermine democracy itself. And so we have competing values, I think, at stake. I think one point that I would say is that it's a strange situation that we have kind of subcontracted this issue to major tech companies, right? Meta, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're all refereeing this. And, some companies do it more responsibly than others. You can always criticize them. But in our country, we have gotten out of the business of regulating media. Europe does it. But it seems to me that I don't have a specific regulation in mind, but it seems to me that one casualty of the kind of dysfunction in Washington is that we have not really taken a serious look at what is the proper balance of these factors. Should not be up to Elon Musk. It should be up to the U.S. Congress as the elected representatives of our society to make those decisions. And they're not making those decisions now, and therefore we're left in the hands of these entrepreneurs to make decisions which really it's not right for them to make. That would be my point of view.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kyle Riepel. I'm a first-year graduate student at the School of Leadership and Public Policy. The next question is, NewsHour is free, but other sources of good journalism are behind paywalls. How do we ensure that everyone has access to good, quality, trustworthy journalism?
More people should watch NewsHour.
Well, if I just may add, it's a great question, but I actually think paying for journalism is important. If we don't, why is journalism in trouble? Because the economic model, like when I was at the Washington Post in the 80s and 90s, the newspaper was fat. There were all these classified ads, all this stuff, and we were in good times, Mike.
We were.
And then those good times went away because of the economic changes. And part of it is that people have been conditioned that they should not have to pay for this. And that's just a wrong point of view. Now, I do think there could be some creative ways to make sure that people who can't afford it, someone made a suggestion, I forgot who it was, that maybe, some of the major news organizations could, each put 2 or 3 stories, into a platform that everyone can read. That would be kind of cool. But I think the fundamental thing, the problem in journalism is not that the problem is that people aren't paying for journalism. That's, to me, the problem.
Yeah, if I could quickly, my sense is very much, when I hear, news yearns to be free. No, it doesn't. It costs an enormous amount of money to put on, to put out the New York Times, to put out the Atlantic, to put out the Washington Post.
To have a foreign desk.
To have a foreign desk.
25 or 30 foreign offices.
Right, and I think that, the mistake had been, or maybe born of necessity, but was, for quite a while there, the digital stuff was all free, and it led to that sense that, it has to be free. And, speaking in very self-interested terms, I have a son who's a musician, and the music business has been hit by the same thing. And you have the same music yearns to be free. No, it doesn't. There are thousands of great musicians who need to be paid. So I think that, I think the question then becomes, what's the cost? And I agree. The other problem is that we still have this digital divide. back in the Stone Age when I was working for a tabloid in New York City, you get onto the subway and every other person had a paper out. It was Daily News, The Post, Newsday, The Times. I mean, that's gone now. And it's hard when you do reporting out, particularly in a lot of working class neighborhoods, you just get the sense there's, the divide. I mean, no one's going online to the New York Times. Frankly, they're not even going online to the New York Post. So, and I think that presents kind of a whole nother troubling challenge for us, and for which I have no brilliant thoughts, unfortunately. Do we have another question?
In your view, what is the role of national publications in fighting state-level efforts seeking to limit press freedom? So think Texas counts chipping away at the Texas Citizens Participation Act or North Carolina's Government Transparency Act. In a federalist society, are local outlets the only parties who can fight against this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And if I understand correctly, the role of national journalism outlets in protecting state-level journalism outlets? Is that
Yes.
right? Yeah. It's a great question, and I think there's an enormous community there. We've seen this time and again. I, as a journalist, have always believed it's less of a profession, it's more of a community. We rely on each other all the time in a number of ways. I saw this in a very pointed and real way overseas, where you weren't competing with journalists from other outlets, you were working together because that's how you all assured that the work got out there and got out there safely in many instances. But I've seen this back here as well. I think the attacks on journalism, whether they happen at a city paper or a state outlet or a national level, journalists feel at a very visceral level. I can't remember which city it was. I will get it wrong if I try to, but there was one outlet that was raided by a local sheriff's office, I believe, and they seized the computers there. Someone in the crowd.
Kansas.
Thank you very much. And, these things come up in our meetings because we all say, what if that was us? I think there's a real sense of camaraderie among journalists. And then the best we can do at that moment is, again, shine a light, ask a question. Why was this done? What is the purpose behind this? And the reason I think we feel that is because we know it is, but for these other news organizations, do we go? We all rely on each other, especially at the national level, especially at PBS. We have some 330 member stations we rely on out there to help get information at that local level and get our news out to their communities. We at the national level are relying on what they do every day. And if they're under attack, then so are we.
I don't have a huge amount to add to that. I mean, I agree with what Amna said, and I do think there are a lot of great national organizations, like the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Reporters Committee, that are kind of being supported by big news operators, and they're really helping out in the field, helping, the small outlets in individual states help, protect against, overreach by the local authorities. So I see that happening. Probably more should be done, but I do see that happening.
Yeah, and I think it's, in some ways, it's not the same level of risk, but it is analogous to what we were talking about with the risks that local reporters take in other countries. Some of the best and earliest reporting, for instance, on Amazon's abuse of workers in warehouses was done by the Allentown Morning Call reporter. That's tough reporting. There's some big Amazon warehouses there. They're big advertisers, they're big powers in that community. And you see that playing out across the United States, and it's something really right to be nourished, both to take pride in that there are these really brave reporters and editors and, frankly, publishers that are putting that stuff in, but also the absolute necessity of supporting them. I think we have time for another question or two.
All right, the next question is, Michael mentioned that fact-based reporting, analysis, opinion are all important, but that you have to know which is which. Some major outlets ostensibly report the facts, but it's really opinion, and the lawyers actually say this out loud when those outlets come under criticism. They try to have it both ways. How do we handle the outlets that try to have it both ways?
I'm not sure what the question has in mind. I think that I'll just give you one practical thing that I think about a lot. When you go to a platform, oftentimes this is very basic, but I think actually it's an issue, where you'll see opinion right next to fact-based reporting. Now, when everything was on paper, right, you knew the front page was where the news was and the editorial page was where opinion was. And while people still would complain about certain reporters or certain stories being biased, you actually knew the difference. And I think for average news consumers, news readers, I think sometimes it just kind of mixes together. And I think it's important really for journalistic outlets to really make clear the difference between the two.
How do you handle NewsHour?
We don't. So a core tenet I hang on to is that it's never my job to tell people what they should think, but it is my job to make them want to think about these issues, and that's my line. But we have elements of analysis and opinion on our show all the time, in the form of a Politics Monday segment, which is much more analysis. We have, reporting and kind of a deeper look at some of the bigger political issues coming up ahead in the week. And then our Friday segment of Brooks and Capehart, which is two opinion columnists who come together to discuss the week's events. And those are very clearly demarcated. And when we have someone on, as we do sometimes from time to time, an opinion editor, an opinion writer, they're clearly labeled as such. You're here to talk to us about this issue. This is this person's job. I think we do more of a lead up on someone's resume on NewsHour than anywhere else because we really want you to know who you're about to hear from. So we take very seriously, clearly messaging to our audience, this is who you're hearing from. Keep this in mind as you hear this information. But I agree with Michael that it is tougher at other outlets. I think specifically, and maybe this is where the question was coming from, cable outlets, where you have a mix of programming. And, I know from an industry insider perspective, I think they believe that they're clearly messaging by saying daytime between these hours is straight news and reporting from people in the field, from experts on these different issues. And then sometimes early in the morning and prime time is more opinion. I don't know that news audiences are as attuned to that as many people inside the industry believe that they are. And that's perhaps where a lot of the confusion comes from, is if it happens under the umbrella of this brand, you think it's all being presented as news. And from the inside, they don't believe that it's being presented that way. There is that disconnect. We have to be better about that.
Right. I think we've come to an end. I want to thank the audience. Those were great questions. Thank you for being here. And thank you very much, both of you. This was terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you to all of you.